record. We need to draw the distinction between what we produce and sell back into regional grids and regional markets versus what we sell here through the retail markets. What we could be able to do is, in theory, if this body, if Virginia chose to continue to endorse producing energy by different means, we could sell that back in regionally, but then purchase and ensure that we're purchasing through a variety of markets clean energy. This is what's necessary for us to be able to boost our economy long term, Mr. Speaker. And it's very clear by numbers that have been given to us through the advanced energy economy that there are way more jobs already in the advanced energy economy than in some of these other industries. So we have a great opportunity to continue to capitalize and at the same time lift Virginia workers.
Will the delegate yield for a final question?
Would the delegate yield for a question?
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I yield for a final
delegate yields.
question.
So again, Mr. Speaker, I would ask the gentleman, maybe this is a basic question. Maybe this has nothing to do with this bill, but it has so much to do with it, I think. Could the gentleman describe for me how something that is created and produced becomes cheaper and easier to acquire if you make it harder and more expensive to produce it and transmit it?
Mr. Speaker, I would tell the gentleman that it is clear we're talking about production that's going to be happening over the next several years, and these mandates give us a decade to be able to, not only do we know today that the cost per kilowatt hour of renewables is certainly on par with every other source that is out there, but on top of that, Mr. Speaker, we have an opportunity to make further advancements, and we've got time to do it. This is a plan that takes us there, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate report, floor amendments. Okay.
Mr. Speaker, there are two separate floor amendments, both offered by Delegate Toscano. The first is on line 47 of the introduced as amended by the committee. His amendment would strike all of lines 47 through 65, strike all amendments through lines 47 through 65, and insert the following, one sentence. Beginning on July 1, 2019, unless preempted by applicable federal law, there shall be a moratorium on approval by any permitting agency of any permit, certificate, or other approval required for any new pipeline with a diameter in excess of 40 inches for the transport of natural gas that requires the use of eminent domain on private property.
I'll ask. Delegate from Charlottesville, Delegate Toscano, can we handle these in a block, or do you want these segregated?
Separate.
Separate. Okay. Delegate Toscano has the floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Speaking to the amendment.
Delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Ladies and gentlemen of the House, I know that there are some concerns about the nature of this so-called moratorium on major fossil fuel projects. And if you looked at the substitute and were willing to vote for the substitute, the whole language of this section would have been stripped out of the bill, so there would not have been any moratorium. And that's why when the delegate from Roanoke said that when you voted for the committee amendment, you essentially voted today yourself for a moratorium on all fossil fuel activities. Now, I'm giving you a chance today to step back from that vote, because you now have a chance to vote to strip out the language that would have a moratorium on all fossil fuel activities. It's drawn directly to the provisions in the bill, and all it does is substitute a couple of different words that speaks to big pipelines. So if you have any concerns about a big pipeline that you don't think is a good idea, but you don't want to get rid of all pipelines and you don't want to prevent moratoriums on all future fossil fuel activities, you should vote for this amendment. And I'd ask you to do so.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
Delegate from Shenandoah, Delegate Gilbert.
Speaking to the amendment.
Delegate has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the
parliamentary
delegate
inquiry.
Delegate Orrock.
Mr. Speaker, I apologize in raising the question, but when I look at the underlying legislation as it came from committee, there was nothing in that measure as it related to any type of pipeline project specific. It spoke to quite the contrary. Everything was about energy generation, distribution, things of that nature. I would just question, Mr. Speaker, whether this amendment is germane, given that it is much narrower in its scope than the original legislation, especially as it relates to the provisions of the moratorium, because this is not a subset of what was in the original moratorium provisions, but is a totally different object.
This is about narrows you can get. It narrows it. Doesn't go beyond the bill. I don't think this is a close call, guys.
There's nothing in the moratorium relative to pipelines.
I mean, you look at the bill, and up in the title, it's moratorium on major fossil fuel energy mandates that come down here, and the moratorium on new major fossil fuel projects, and list those in detail. And instead of that type of moratorium, is putting in a moratorium or approving of any. I mean, the distinction would be any new pipeline. That's the point you're making.
And the point I'm making is that's not what's in the current laundry list of the original legislation. So as it narrows it on the one hand, it goes beyond.
That's what's in the original legislation.
So it's a moratorium, and the moratorium up in the title, and you're going to be figure that for you to decide, obviously, that it's a
But could this then, if we offered a floor amendment, to be a moratorium in any kind of
I think the amendment's germane. Thank the delegate from Shenandoah, Delegate Gilbert.
Speaking to the amendment, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I just wanted to thank the delegate from Charlottesville for giving us an opportunity to vote on our principles. I think we're going to do that shortly. And I would yield to the delegate from Caroline.
Delegate from Caroline, Delegate Orrock.
Mr. Speaker, I'd move to pass by the amendment.
Delegate Orrock moves to pass by the amendment. All those.
Mr. Speaker.
Delegate from Charlottesville, Delegate Casano.
Speaking to the motion.
Delegate has the floor.
I find it ironic that the delegate from Shenandoah says, well, here's we have our chance to vote on our principles. And what do we get? A movement to pass by the amendment. You not even want to vote on the amendment. Now, we know what the pass by the amendment means. It means that you're voting for a moratorium on all fossil fuel activities, right? That's what it's going to mean, so let everybody notice around here what's happening. I ask you to vote against the motion to pass by, and maybe we will get a chance to vote on our principles.
The motion is to pass by the amendment. All those in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. Chair is in doubt. Ayes and nays are called for. Shall the amendment be passed by? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 51, noes 48.
Ayes 51, noes 48. The amendment is passed by. So now we're on your second amendment, I think, Delegate Toscano.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I need to report it.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker.
I'm sorry, clerk report a floor amendment.
Floor amendment number 2 offered by Delegate Toscano, to the on line, 2 parts of it. On line 102 of the introduced, after the word that, line 102, after the word that, strike the number 40 and insert the number 20. Then 2 lines further on, line 104, after the word color, insert, and 20% shall be allocated to sea level rise mitigation and recurrent flooding adaptation measures.
Delegate from Charlottesville, Delegate Toscano.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the amendment.
Delegate has the floor.
So, Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, here's an opportunity for you to speak out in favor of sea level rise mitigation and recurrent flooding adaptation measures. We know it's a very serious problem, and it's happening whether or not you agree with climate change. And we know it's going to be very costly for places like Virginia Beach, Norfolk, other places in and around the coastal areas to solve a problem that's coming at us. So here's your opportunity to say, okay, at least if this bill passes, we want to allocate 20% of the funds for that purpose. I hope you will vote for the amendment.
Delegate from Caroline, Delegate Orrock.
Mr. Speaker, I move to pass by the amendments in a block.
Delegate Orrock moves to pass by the amendments in a block. All those in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. Chair is in doubt. Ayes and nays are called for. Shall the amendments in a block that were just referenced be passed by? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 51, noes 48.
Ayes 51, noes 48. The amendment is passed by. The clerk will report another floor amendment.
Mr. Speaker, there is a floor amendment, additional floor amendment, this one offered by Delegate Rasool. It is in three parts. It is as follows. On amendment number 1, on line 36 of the original, after the word years, strike 2028 through 2035, 80%, and insert the years 2030 through 2050, 30%. Amendment number 2, in the following line, line 37, after the expression in calendar year, strike 2036 and insert 2051. And amendment number 3, offered by Delegate Rasool, at the beginning of line 45 of the introduced, just several lines further on, strike 2028 through 2035 and in 2036. And instead substitute the years 2030 through 2050 and in 2051.
Delegate from Roanoke City, Delegate Rasool, speaking to the floor amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Speaking to the floor amendments.
Delegate has the floor.
You know, we love this process that we have in place because it slows things down. It gives people an opportunity to think through policy that's important to us. And I think that we shouldn't take this lightly. This warning that is most of the rest of the developed world has come together and said, we need to develop a plan. And look, I get it. Virginia we like to take our time and be methodical about it. And so in doing so, we developed a substitute that had a number of changes. In these amendments were some of the core changes that give us a consensus. While not all of them are exactly where I want to be, I'm happy to be able to work together with so many of you to develop the Virginia way of how we're going to build a clean energy economy, help so many Virginia workers who can benefit from this, and at the same time, help to protect our coastal communities. So I hope, Mr. Speaker, these 3 amendments, which are meant to more closely mirror the timeline that we talked about in the substitute, I hope that we will accept these floor amendments.
Delegate from Caroline, Delegate Orrock.
Mr. Speaker, I move to pass by the amendments in block.
Delegate Orrock moves to pass by the amendments in a block. All those in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. No. Chair is in doubt. Ayes and nays are called for.
Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, speaking to the motion.
Delegate from Roanoke City, Delegate Rasool.
Just to be clear, what we're voting on right now is that these amendments help to extend the timeline. So by not endorsing these amendments, you in fact would like, as would I, but you would like to see a more aggressive plan in the way we can approach this. So I hope, be very mindful of these floor amendments, that we will in fact vote no to the motion to pass by.
Mr. Speaker.
Delegate from Scott, Delegate Kilgore.
Mr. Speaker, I think by voting yes, though, you'll give the gentleman from Roanoke an opportunity to vote exactly how he felt when he introduced this bill. Exactly what you wanted to do to make us more aggressive than Hawaii, more aggressive than California, raise our electricity rates. So here's your opportunity, and we're going to give you that opportunity. So I suggest that we vote yes.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the floor amendment, in fact, I'd like to correct a couple of facts.
Mr. Speaker,
Delegate
point
has
of
the
order.
floor, 2 minutes for each side.
Point of order also, the gentleman is, I don't believe the gentleman is speaking to the floor amendment.
Speak.
Delegate needs to make sure he's speaking to the floor amendment. Yes.
Mr. Speaker, speaking to the motion to pass by the floor amendments.
Delegate has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, we heard a couple of facts here earlier. In fact, what we see here is in some of these other states, they don't even allow for the participation in the regional markets through some of their initiatives. We continue to do so. In fact, in this piece of legislation, we have a carve-out for small additional infrastructure changes that we need as we are thinking through how we're going to build infrastructure. So, Mr. Speaker, I hope that we will vote against the motion to pass by the amendments.
Shall the floor amendment offered by Delegate Rasool be passed by in a block? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 51, noes 48.
Ayes 51, noes 48. Those amendments are passed by. The delegate from Fauquier, Delegate Weber.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the gentleman yield, or will the delegate yield for a question?
Will the delegate yield for a question?
I yield.
Delegate yields.
My question is, Mr. Speaker, there's numerous folks that have signed on as co-patrons of this piece of legislation before we started amending it in committee. And as that piece of legislation moves through the process, and we have this original piece of legislation in front of us, would the governor sign it?
Mr. Speaker, I would respond to the gentleman by saying we would have to let the legislative process play out, as we need to send this on over to the Senate. So I can't wait for this to pass out, go to the Senate, and then together the delegate from Fauquier and I can ask the governor.
Further question, Mr. Speaker.
Will the delegate yield for another question?
I yield.
Delegate yields.
As the piece of legislation that came before us in Commerce and Labor puts a moratorium on the production of energy that uses fossil fuels, is the gentleman aware that in Warren County we recently just finished a natural gas power plant that sits on a pipeline that sends electricity into Northern Virginia, that pays millions of dollars in taxes to Warren County? And if we shut that down in 10, 15, 20, 30 years, then who makes up the tax difference when that plant shuts down?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would respond to the gentleman from Fauquier to say that, of course, as we've talked about before, there's a difference between the production and then the retail sale. So again, that production, especially if it's by Dominion Power, is sold into a regional market and then is repurchased. And so should we have some facilities that we would like to extend the use of beyond the moratorium, it would be very clear, Mr. Speaker, we would just need to sell that into the regional market and purchase our clean energy mandates.
I thank the gentleman.
Delegate from Fairfax, Delegate Hugo.
Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman from Roanoke, delegate from Roanoke, answer a couple questions?
Will the delegate yield for a question?
I yield.
Delegate yields.
Mr. Speaker, you know, I'm very sympathetic to the renewable green energy bill, and I think this body has been over the years. In fact, within the last decade or so, I think we did the first net metering provision we put in. It was one of my provisions. I think we worked with the body here on the M&T tax, that we got rid of that. Last year, I think gentleman from Gate City went from 50 to 5,000 on solar. We put solar in the public interest, energy efficiency in public interest. And today, I think we're going to lift the cap or increase the cap for net metering. But I guess my question, so I guess this body has been sympathetic and wants to be sympathetic to reasonable approaches to do what you're talking about. But I guess a couple questions here. I'm curious. So under your provision, under your bill, there'd be no more natural gas plants or no more even, I guess, coal plants like the one in Virginia City that meets all EPA standards. Is that correct?
Mr. Speaker, I would respond to my friend from Fairfax, who in fact voted for the bill out of committee, that we are talking about a moratorium on future production. And yes, we would not produce more of these plants moving forward.
And Mr. Speaker, would the gentleman yield for another question?
Will the delegate yield for another question?
I yield.
And we talk about, you know, we not just have the coal industry that's here, it's important in the Commonwealth, but we have the rail. So if we wanted to increase rail that was going to transport coal or increase the port facilities anywhere that we're going to export coal around the world, around the country maybe, would your bill prohibit that also? So it's not just energy, it's jobs related to rail, jobs related to ports, the way we read the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would respond to the delegate by stating that this would not impact that.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Speaker, another question? Gentleman, yield for another,
Delegate yield for another question.
I yield for a final question, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate yields.
I would just say, with respect to that last, I just strongly disagree, and that's not how everybody else is reading it. But let me ask this question here. One of the things, if you look at the press releases and the accolades that your bill has gotten in the press, so this bill is up there or exceeds what they've done in California, that you are very popular on the West Coast and Roanoke here, obviously. But California has a 50% goal by 2030, but relative to California, how much does Virginia consumers and Virginia businesses pay? How much more expensive is California's electricity on average than that here in the Commonwealth?
Mr. Speaker, I will respond to the gentleman by saying as much as I'd like to talk about California, which has 5 times our population and 4 times our geographic size, we are dealing with the legislation that is before us. We have worked together to try to figure out what we can be doing. And in fact, there are 2 key differences, Mr. Speaker, about what is happening in other states, specifically in California, than here. Number 1, if you look on lines 58 and 59, you will see a carve-out that is there to ensure that there is additional minimal production that happens just to ensure that we do not impede the growth of some Virginia businesses who need further time for this production. And number 2, Mr. Speaker, it is very clear in the California bill, which is more aggressive, it says that California will not be able to participate in the regional markets with regards to how it impacts clean energy mandates.
Mr. Speaker, may I speak briefly to the measure?
Delegate has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, I appreciate the gentleman's comments, and I think where his heart is on this bill, but I think his heart needs to follow his head on this. Everybody needs to think about this very, very carefully. The answer to my question, Virginia rates versus California rates, 68% higher in California. That's where he's pushing us, 68%. Now, if you've got a business in the Commonwealth of Virginia, or if you're a homeowner, a parent, I want you to think about that. What happens when we have data centers in Northern Virginia, across the Commonwealth. energy-intensive endeavors. When their costs go up 68%, what does that mean? Now, many of you here in this body, I know, probably doing pretty well. 68% when your rates go up at your house, what does that mean? Now, I've just got a question. Maybe a lot of you can afford it, but if your rates go up maybe $100 a month, that's a lot for a lot of families. That's shoes, might be the mortgage payment for added up, 6 months, might be the tuition, might be something that you're not going to have to make a choice on now because your rates have gone through the roof. I do think it impacts coal and shipping, and I think that's an imperative that we need to consider because that's jobs across the Commonwealth. How many jobs are related to the port? How many jobs are related to exports? I think we need to think, too, what happened just last year? It's a little cold outside today, everybody noticed. I believe last year about this time, natural gas, they had to cut it off to Hampton Roads. A lot of businesses had to shut down because they did not have a supply of energy that was reliable. I think if you're worried about renewables, there's a lot of things we can do. There's a lot of things we have done, and there's a lot of things we can do working together. But ladies and gentlemen, this is not one of them. This is an endeavor that will hurt families. This is an endeavor that will eviscerate businesses, and this is an endeavor that will cost jobs in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I hope you vote no, put this bill down. Let's work together on the right thing to do the right thing for our economy and for the environment in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Thank you.
Delegate from Scott, Delegate Kilgore.
Mr. Speaker, speak to the bill.
Delegate has the floor.
Mr. Speaker, ladies and gentlemen of the House, last year we were pleased to work with so many in this House chamber on a comprehensive energy legislation that moved the goalpost, that moved the ball. Has it related to solar? Has it related to renewable energies? Has it related to energy efficiency? Has it related to a lot of areas in the energy field that a lot of us are interested in? And we worked on that as a team, and we worked on that together. But, energy legislation is hard. It's really hard as you look through this process, as you work through the process. It's like a balloon. The air's got to go somewhere. There has to be a grid that we have when you go turn that light on. Those lights you expect to come on. We've got one of the best grids in the on the East Coast here in Virginia. Our electricity is low here in Virginia, and that's why that we are a great state to do business. But we were all the above last year. I'm all the above when it comes to energy choices. We as the gentleman from Fairfax just stated, we increased the amount of solar. We increased the amount of wind. But the wind does not blow all the time. About 25% of the time, you can get energy from solar. 30% of the time, you can get it from wind. 50% if the wind is offshore. We're not even anywhere near offshore. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you look at what we did last year, we balanced out exactly where we need to go as a Commonwealth. That's what we did. But I could say if we did this and become more aggressive than California, more aggressive than Hawaii, and look at where our bills would go, we're right now, we would have to increase our renewable energy generation by 94% to meet the requirements of this piece of legislation. That's going to be passed on to who? The ratepayers. That's who's going to have to pay that bill. So a vote for this, let me be clear, a vote for this is absolutely a vote for higher energy cost. A vote for this is absolutely a vote for higher energy cost on those individuals who can least afford to pay an energy bill. I'm here, I'm ready and able to work on energy policy as it goes to this General Assembly, but this is not the right energy policy for our Commonwealth. And I hope you defeat this bill. Thank you.
Delegate from Virginia Beach, Delegate Davis.
Mr. Speaker, rise to speak briefly. Briefly speak to the bill.
Delegate has the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate where this is looking at, but I just want to approach this just from how do we look 30 to 50 years ahead and say what we will do then. And I'll give you a prime example from this bill. Let's just look at it from a technology perspective. You'll see in the top of the bill, it stops the use of fossil fuels, defined as coal. Heck, on line 61, it even prevents the further exploration for fossil fuels, which is coal. Now let's look at technology today, for example, and one thing that we'll realize is when you look at solar power, MIT is already doing the research that powdered coal is, you need 7 layers of silicon to have the same sunlight absorption and energy transference as 1 layer of what? Powdered coal, the stuff that this bill would stop us looking for. By the way, you look at ultracapacitors, this amazing energy source. They're the largest company that deals in ultracapacitors, uses graphene for those ultracapacitors. And what's one of the largest sources for that? It's coal. Talk to Delegate Scott with what's going on with graphene potentially here out in the western part of the state. The biggest concern, Mr. Speaker, I'll say is we're trying to dictate today on what we should be doing, which honestly I don't think we understand how the technology is going to change and how this will actually short the use of technology to solve these problems that the delegate's actually trying to solve.
Delegate from Norfolk, Delegate Lindsay.
Speaking to the bill.
Delegate has the floor.
Sometimes when I'm listening to the arguments of my colleagues, certain things get my attention. This would be one particular piece of legislation that has captured my attention because sometimes we get so caught up in the rhetoric on the floor that we don't look at how people actually voted in committee and subcommittee. So let me refresh some recollections. In the subcommittee, this bill would pass through subcommittee 9-7. And when I look at the votes in favor of this bill advancing from subcommittee, we're not even talking about committee. We had yeas from Chairman Hugo, who was the chairman of that committee, and we had delegates Ward, Keene, Fillicorn, Corey, Bagby, Toscano, Mullen, and Bourne in the yay category. In the nay category, we had Kilgore, O'Quinn, Ransom, Wilt, Head, myself, and Delegate Heretic. So sometimes we try to get caught up in gotcha moments. We try to get caught up in playing to the press. I submit that if there's air with this bill, it was bipartisan. And that bipartisan air didn't just stop in the subcommittee. I could go on and read the committee, but I won't bore you with those details. I'll simply say there were votes, both Republican and Democrat, to get it out of subcommittee and likewise to advance it through committee.
Delegate from Shenandoah, Delegate Gilbert.
Speaking to the bill, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate has the floor.
Well, there's a theme emerging this week, Mr. Speaker, not just one, but there's a second theme, I think, and it is the lengths to which our Democrat colleagues will go to hide what they truly have as their underlying agenda. We saw several amendments on the floor today walking back this very bold plan, in the delegate from Roanoke's words, in an effort to try to minimize it and diminish it and water it down, because we are right here now in front of everybody discussing it in the light of day. And that is not a comfortable place for a Democrat agenda to be. Mr. Speaker, I dare say that although most people believe that we should be more careful stewards of our environment, they would be shocked to learn the actual consequences to them and their pocketbooks and their job opportunities and their businesses if they knew the real consequences of this legislation and the people and intentions behind it. My favorite part of this is to try to frame it as a jobs bill. If this is a jobs bill for anybody, Mr. Speaker, it is for the candle maker. Candle making will become an art that is renewed here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, because we will need those candles at night during the rolling blackouts and brownouts, when we don't have reliable energy at the ready, when the switch doesn't work, when we can't afford to pay our electric bill and our electric service gets cut off. the lengths to which this idea goes, which will, again, completely destroy and eviscerate our ability to generate reliable energy in this Commonwealth. I would say, you know, if you took a satellite photograph of Virginia in this dystopian future that is trying to be created for us, that it would look, at night, it would look a lot more like North Korea on a satellite map at night than it does the Commonwealth of Virginia that we know and love. It will be dark and devoid of reliable energy, Mr. Speaker. This agenda, this radical agenda that is behind this, and that I'm not talking about the agenda of being careful stewards of our world. I'm talking about a much more radical agenda than that. Really misses the point, which is that here in the United States of America, we have been able to oversee really the largest energy boom in our history, while at the same time reducing carbon emissions more than any other country in the world. We can do both of these things. We can have reliable energy and be careful, good stewards of our world. And we have proven that here in the United States of America. We don't need this legislation to clean up our world and our country and our Commonwealth. So there is something else behind it. I'll leave it to the delegate to explain what it might be. But I do get sick a little bit, Mr. Speaker, of our Democratic colleagues trying to have both a monopoly on science and on caring about the poor. Because this bill is not reliant on science. In fact, it ignores science, real science, and it ignores the impact that it will have on those who are least able to afford to pay for this agenda. Mr. Speaker, the science doesn't work. The economics certainly don't work. The logistics don't work. And the only other folks that aren't going to work is a whole lot of Virginians if this bill becomes law, because this will decimate our economy, our businesses, our ability to attract businesses, and everything else that we know and love here in Virginia. So thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Delegate from Caroline, Delegate Orrock.
Mr. Speaker, I move the pending question.
Delegate from Caroline, Delegate Orrock, moves the pending question. All those in favor of that motion will say aye. Aye. All those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The pending question is moved. Shall the bill be engrossed and passed to third reading? All those in ayes and nays are called for. Shall the bill be engrossed and passed to third reading? Clerk will close the roll.
Ayes 12, noes 86.
Ayes 12, noes 86. The bill is defeated.